Nicolae Ceausescu was the second and last communist leader of Romania from 1965 until his death in 1989. Ceausescu's reign was similar to that of other communist rulers of the mid-20th century, characterized by the harsh treatment of anyone who spoke out against him, the fostering of a cult of personality around him, and the sudden and dreadful end to his rule in the midst of revolution. Where Ceausescu set himself apart from his communist peers was in the foreign policy decisions he made concerning the Soviet bloc and Western nations. The calamitous decisions made in the name of Romanian nationalism, the over-the-top tales of excessiveness, and distinct foreign policy decisions are what make Nicolae Ceausescu such an interesting leader of his time and the topic of this episode of Who Was. Ceausescu was born in 1918, one of 10 children of a peasant family in a small village about 75 miles or 120 kilometers west of Bucharest, called Was Nicolae, which I'm probably mispronouncing. His father, Andruța, was a farmer, for a time the mayor of Was Nicolae, and also supported his large family through tailoring. After Nicolae's rule had ended, the Romanian press would report that his father was an alcoholic and would beat his wife and children. He was a religious man and very strict with his family. Nicolae studied in the village until the age of 11, at which point he ran away from home and his intensely religious and strict father to Bucharest, the capital of Romania. There he stayed with his oldest sister, Nicolina, who would come to the capital to find work. Nicolae soon became an apprentice shoemaker. At this time in Romania, the late 1920s and early 30s, the country was a constitutional monarchy, still officially known as the Kingdom of Romania. After the end of World War I in 1918 and the dissolution of Austria-Hungary, there was a great amount of unsteadiness in the region, with different peoples spread across the land and new borders being drawn that separated those from their own. Transylvania, Bukovina, and Bessarabia were united with the Kingdom of Romania, decisions that were made by the ethnic Romanian majorities in those regions. There was much stress associated with the creation of what was known as Greater Romania through these unions, given the different cultural identities for those people involved. This unease, combined with the rising communist doctrine from the east, meant that big changes were in order for Romania. Ceausescu apprenticed in the workshop of Alexandru Sandulescu, who was an active member in the Communist Party, the then illegal Communist Party. The country was under a democratic government, and it was pursuing economic growth policies that made the most of its newfound land and oil fields, and its leaders saw communism as a boon to this. However, the 30s were marked with social unrest following unemployment and strikes from new policies, and the Communist Party gained momentum. Nicolae became involved in the party in his teens, being arrested several times across the country for communist activities. Once for street fighting at a strike, another time for petitioning signatures to protest a trial, and by 1936, the Romanian secret police had declared him a dangerous communist agitator. He was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. Soon after finishing his sentence, he was arrested again and spent most of World War II in prison and internment camps. Perhaps this was a fortunate turn of events for Nicolae, as Romania was situated in a geographically unlucky region. The country faced pressures from the Soviets to the east and the Axis to the west, losing much of its territory during the war to those powers. Eventually, a fascist government under Ion Antonescu was established, after the king abdicated his throne in 1940. Romania sided with Nazi Germany. The country was bombed extensively by the Allies, since they were the primary source of oil for the Third Reich. Romania was also home to many of the atrocities of the Holocaust. During the war, growing discontent for the fascist government within the population peaked with King Michael's coup in 1944, and Romania switched sides to join the Allies, finishing the war with them. Even though they contributed to the fall of the Third Reich, the Romanians' involvement with the Axis was not forgotten, and they were treated as such in the years following the war, under the occupation of the Soviet Union. In 1943, Ceausescu was transferred to the Târgu internment camp, located in the Carpathian Mountains. It was there that the 25-year-old shared a cell with Gheorghe Georgiou-Dej. This was the start of Ceausescu's rise in the Communist Party. Georgiou-Dej took a lead role of the communists in prison in Târgu, and Nicolae fell into being his protege, oftentimes acting as the enforcer for Georgiou-Dej. Ceausescu would beat party members who would not attend his master's self-criticism sessions, designed to push his interpretation of the communist dogma. As the war ended and the country began to fall under Soviet influence, the Communist Party began to gain more strength. In 1947, they fraudulently seized power in an election, with a fabricated 70% of the vote. Georgiou-Dej became the first communist leader, the General Secretary, and forced the king to abdicate his throne, declaring Romania a People's Republic. During the time of his master's rule, Ceausescu held a number of positions in the communist government and military. He was head of the Ministry of Agriculture, then Deputy Minister of the Armed Forces, eventually being brought on to the Central Committee, which was kind of like the board of directors for the Communist Party. In the 40s and 50s, two communist factions had emerged, and Ceausescu found himself again on the right side. The Home Communists were favored over the Muscovites by Joseph Stalin, given that the leader of the Muscovites in Romania was Jewish and Stalin held anti-Semitic views. Ceausescu eventually rose to the second highest position in party hierarchy, and in 1947 he married Elena Petrescu, who would be by his side and play a part in his political life until the day he died. During the majority of Giorgio Dej's rule, Romania was under direct military occupation and economic control of the USSR. The government established Soviet Romanian companies to exploit Romania's natural resources for the benefit of the Soviets. Private firms were nationalized and agriculture was collectivized, with the goal of eliminating the social hierarchy in towns and villages. Political liberties were taken away and dissent was suppressed by the secret police. During those initial years, several purges of enemies of the state occurred, and many forms of punishment were pursued by the government. A commission would later estimate that near 2 million people were subjected to communist repression. Giorgio Dej died of lung cancer in 1965, and there was a scramble in the days after to elect a new general secretary. Even though Nicolae occupied the second highest position in the party, he was not the first choice for the job. However, infighting among older officials led them to choose Nicolae for the position, given his relationship to Giorgio Dej and the agreeability to all. 3 days after the death of his leader, at the age of 47, Nicolae was the most powerful man in Romania. Ceausescu was initially a popular head of state, both among his countrymen and internationally. He pursued policies similar to those of his predecessor, with the goal of forging trading ties with the West and distanced himself from the Soviet Union, all to make a strong, independent Romania. He declared himself president of the State Council, the executive authority, 2 years into his rule to consolidate his power. One of the most surprising decisions made in the initial years was Nicolae's move to end active participation in the Warsaw Pact, which, if you're unfamiliar, was a defense treaty among the Soviet Union and its satellite states created in response to NATO. Ceausescu refused to take part in the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Warsaw Pact forces, even going as far to condemn the action in a speech. As you would imagine, this garnered praise from the Western nations, all to the distaste of the Eastern Bloc. All of Ceausescu's economic, foreign, and demographic policies were meant to achieve his ultimate goal: turning Romania into one of the world's great powers. He did not want his country to ride the coattails of the Soviet Union. He wanted the history books to speak of Romania on the same terms as the US or Britain or the USSR. A method for achieving this goal was embodied in the infamous 1966 decree, which outlawed abortion with strict penalties for the practice and had measures to boost what Ceausescu saw as a low fertility rate. The math behind this was that more children equals more production equals economic success. The goal for this decree was to raise the country's population by 30%, however the methods to achieve this were astonishing. Overnight, contraceptives disappeared from all stores, all women were monitored by gynecologists, and detected pregnancies were followed until birth by the state. Motherhood was praised as the greatest service a woman could do for a country, and mothers of 5 or more children were entitled to significant benefits. As a direct consequence, there was a massive baby boom, and the average number of children per woman went from 1.9 to 3.7 in a year. While these figures were hailed as a success by Ceausescu, there were a number of negative externalities. The economic pressure on families to raise so many children was severe, and many children were sent to orphanages simply because their parents could not support them. Women began opting for primitive methods of abortion in secret, leading to infection, sterility, and death. The mortality rate among pregnant women was the highest of Europe during the reign of Ceausescu. While the childbed mortality rate kept declining over the years in neighboring countries, in Romania it increased to more than 10 times that of its neighbors. This was by far the most infamous and consequential domestic policy decision Ceausescu made. Nicolae took a trip to China, North Korea, Mongolia, and North Vietnam in 1971, a kind of Eastern communism tour, although I'm not sure it was branded as such. This trip had a huge impact on how Nicolae decided to rule his country. He was so impressed with the leaders of these states and how they fostered a cult of personality around themselves. Mao Zedong and Kim Il-sung had dominated their nations, were ultra-nationalistic, and broke from the yoke of the USSR. He wished to emulate that. This was summed up in a speech before his executive committee upon his return, what became known as the July Theses, in which he spoke of 17 proposals. Basically, these put the Communist Party's propaganda machine at full steam and suppressed cultural autonomy. Up until this point, Romania had been fairly liberal with how they allowed free thinking, but now non-compliant individuals were attacked and institutions that encouraged free thought were rearranged to preach the communist ideology. Ceausescu was graciously portrayed in the media, with younger images of himself used. They didn't have Photoshop in those days. And he insisted on calling himself the conductor, or leader. Although we now know that this melding of state and society often leads to issues and revolt, we might understand how Nicolae thought this was the right move for his country. He had been hearing the communist ideology since he was in his teens, so he must have truly believed that the party was meant to enlighten the people. That, or perhaps it had all gotten to his head, and he wished to be elevated to the divine status that his peers in the East, Mao and Kim, had been. 1974 saw Nicolae further consolidate his power by naming himself the President of the Socialist Republic of Romania. This made him the absolute head of state, requiring no one else's permission for any decisions. He would be elected every 5 years until 1989, a landslide every election because he was the only candidate. The 70s saw a Romanian oil boom thanks to high prices due to the Arab oil embargo. Ceausescu saw this as an opportunity to invest heavily in the country's oil production and refining capabilities. While an opportunistic decision at the time, there was no money in the country coffers to build the refineries, leading Ceausescu to borrow heavily from Western banks, hoping to pay back the loans with the windfall of oil profits. However, the production was delayed, and an earthquake in the capital further delayed his plans. With loan payments looming, a miners' strike in 1977 was another thorn in Nicolae's side, a feeling he would increasingly have as time passed. After Romanian soldiers were reluctant to fire upon the 30,000 workers in the Jiu Valley miners' strike, Ceausescu compromised to give them better pay and working conditions. Although many of the strike's leaders would die a few years later, and it would be revealed that the secret police had ordered doctors to give the men 5-minute chest x-rays during health exams. All the while, Nicolae kept the relationship with the West open, making international visits to Japan and the UK, and attending the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. Little did he know that this relationship with the Western Bloc was only because they saw him and Romania as an opening in the Iron Curtain, an opportunity to create unrest in the Warsaw Pact. The billions of dollars in favorable loans that he was able to take from those Western countries ended up crippling his Romania economically. The social, political, and economic events of the 80s came to a head in 1989 with the Romanian Revolution. Other countries of the Warsaw Pact had already seen their communist governments toppled, and protests stemming from the eviction of a Hungarian pastor gained steam in the city of Timisoara, eventually becoming a fully fledged populist revolution. After a botched speech in Bucharest, which Nicolae had hoped to quell the violence, but instead stoked the fire as the dictator was not able to speak over the cries from the crowd, the military switched sides to back the revolutionaries, spelling the beginning of the end for Nicolae and his wife Elena. Riots in several Romanian cities in December of 1989 prompted the Ceausescus to flee the capital after that botched speech on December 22nd, as a group of protesters forced their way into the Ministry of Defense. Leaving by helicopter with protesters literally at their heels portrayed the couple as fugitives, and in the people's eyes at the time, guilty of the crimes they were accused of. As the Ceausescus fled the capital, their pilot faked problems with the helicopter, probably to avoid harm to himself, and landed. After some car rides, the couple ended up captured by the director of a technical school and turned over to the local police, who held them to await trial. A few days later, on December 24th, Ion Iliescu, head of what would become the new government, court-martialed Nicolae and Elena. In the trial that followed the next day, the two were convicted in just 2 hours of the genocide of 60,000 people, subversion of state power, destruction of public property, undermining the national economy, and attempting to flee the country with $1 billion in foreign banks. A number of issues came out of this trial, with the little evidence that there was to back the charges. Nicolae himself said after the trial that, "We could have just been shot without having this masquerade." The couple was sentenced to die, marched outside the courtroom and shot to death by 4 paratroopers, all of which was filmed by a crew and released to the Romanian and international media immediately. Ceausescu's life ended on Christmas Day, 1989, slumped over himself, his wife fallen to his right, with 120 bullets shot through the pair of them. The two were the last people to be executed in the country of Romania, and the only communist leader to have his government violently overthrown. His legacy remains as a brutal totalitarian leader, who showed glimmers of policy brilliance, but is ultimately remembered as a failed head of state. Thanks for watching this episode of Who Was. This channel takes a historical figure every other week and examines their life and times to find out what makes that person worth knowing about. Next episode, we'll ask the question, who was the Roman Emperor Nero? If you enjoyed this episode, please find a way of letting me know. That could be through a like on the video or a comment telling me how it could be better. And if you think it's worth it, please subscribe and follow this channel as we delve into more interesting historical figures. Thanks again.